Next, starting with that. Oh, oh, wrong. There we go. Okay. Everything is in place, locked and loaded. Let me just give it a second to make sure that others have logged in through the YouTube link. Looks like everything is stable and working. All right, so let's get down to work. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me as we continue our discussion of the topic of suffering. If you've been watching since the beginning and learning along with me, you'll realize that this topic covers a great deal of territory. Now, last week we were talking about some of the suffering that is caused by poverty and some of the need for remedy of it. That is to say that when somebody is suffering due to economic hardship, we do not blame them, but instead look for opportunities to help them. And we see this as being a blessing from God through us who can help, and of course, a blessing to the person in need. So this is a critical mental shift that unfortunately many people in the modern world still have trouble with, still thinking that those that are having economic difficulty are being punished or are deserving of their condition. Judaism does not say that they are being punished or deserving. Even in the cases where they might be, was an important caveat we had last week, even in a place where they might be, we are still in a position and obligated to help them. Now, if that was true with poverty, well, what do we then say about health issues? Like we've been talking about now for a number of weeks, some of the problems that we have in life are self-inflicted or inflicted by others, each as we exercise our free will. But illness very often has very little to do with our free will. We can perhaps point to a few issues that can be self-induced. If you decide to play around with radioactive material, then, well, I guess you're kind of responsible for that. But barring those kinds of circumstances, even where someone might be engaged in somewhat risky behavior, we do not have a tendency to say that you earned this or you deserve it. On the other hand, as we will see, there are passages in the Tanakh, in the Bible, that seem to indicate that illnesses are being applied by God. And if that is the case, then what is our duty to heal? What is our ability to heal? When we heal somebody or ourselves with mundane means, are we thwarting God's will? After all, if the Egyptians had been able to alleviate all of the suffering of the plagues, wouldn't we have still been stuck in Egypt? And wouldn't they still have not been punished for their crimes? And wouldn't that have been wrong? So what role does healing play, and how do we view the illnesses that we face within the tapestry of God's justice and God's world? I have found in my own rabbinate, coming up on 20 years now, that this is often the unspoken but deeply important question that many people have. Occasionally, people will muster the courage to ask if their illness is somehow a punishment from God. But I find that more people think that might be the case than are actually willing to articulate it. Equally, I find many people who have fallen away from Judaism to have done so because they have witnessed great suffering that was connected to a physical illness and feel that it was unfair that God did that to a loved one or themselves. And thus they have abandoned religion as part of their life. I would hope that through our discussion today, and well, probably next week, we'll see how much material we get to today and how much is needed to continue the theme next week. But I would hope that our discussion will help people avoid those particular flaws, because truly, when people are ill, it is the strength that comes from God, from community, and our faith that is often able to help support us during those crises. And through to healing or to other resolutions, but to a resolution with more peace. Let's go ahead and begin, and well, we'll see where this leads us. So we're going to begin here on Exodus 15. We just read this a few weeks ago, well, let's see what it says. If you will hearken, yes, hearken to the voice of Adonai your God, and what is right in his eyes will do, and will give ear to his commandments and keep all his laws. All sickness which I have imposed upon Egypt, I will not impose upon you, for I am Adonai, your healer. All right, so superficial reading, which, mind you, does not mean the most correct reading. Superficial reading could lead me to think that reading it here, especially in this particular formatting of the English, that I am being presented with a very straightforward, conditional description of what I can expect for my health. That if I am willing to follow the commandments, do what God has asked, live according to God's ways, then sickness will stay away from me. Because after all, God is my healer, and therefore God will heal me if anything would even hint at coming into my life. But that's only going to happen, it would appear to be in our first reading here, if I am actually obeying the mitzvah. So it seems, again, superficial reading, and one that is very common, that what this is telling me is that it is very simple. Do what God asks, and you will be healthy. If you are sick, you must have done something wrong. Do something right, and God will heal you. It seems to be just that easy. However, only a few chapters later, in fact, from this week's Torah portion of Mishpatim, we have a very different statement. And if men, this is from Exodus 21, pardon me. And if men strive together, and one smite another with a stone or with his fist, and he die, but keeps his bed, meaning he's still bedridden, but he's not dead, if he rise again and walk abroad upon his staff, then shall he that struck him be acquitted, meaning that you will not be considered to be a murderer, because after all, they didn't die. Only he, meaning the attacker, shall pay for the loss of his time and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. Okay, so very simple tort legislation. Well, simple in its statement, and much more complicated in its details, but a superficial read here would seem to indicate that when there is an act of violence between two people, one attacking the other, that in the event that somebody is injured, that the attacker is responsible for paying for the damages, both the loss of time and thus loss of wages or earning, and for any expenses incurred to heal the person that was attacked. Now, superficial from Exodus 21 and superficial from Exodus 15 would seem to contradict each other. Because after all, if Exodus 15 is saying that as long as we do what's right, God will keep all problems away from us because God is our healer, then Exodus 21 would appear to be suggesting the opposite, which is that in certain circumstances, when you got attacked, which presumably is still under God's control if we're reading superficial Exodus 15, nonetheless, Exodus 21 says that someone else has to pay for it and actually do the healing. But why would they heal me? After all, it may be wrong that they attacked me, but the fact that I got injured must be God's will, and therefore my injury can only be healed by God, or should only be healed by God, because, well, that's the reward for doing the commandments. And if God allowed me to be injured, then it must mean that God wanted me to be injured. So we can see that there is a superficial contradiction on this. Now, this superficial reading is exacerbated by other passages. We're going to look at one of the most famous, taken here from the second book of Chronicles, chapter 16. And in the 30th and 9th year of his reign, Asa was diseased in his feet. Right, so Asa was one of the kings, and not an especially good one. His disease was exceedingly great. Yet in his disease, he sought not the Lord, but to the physicians. And Asa slept with his fathers and died in the 140th year of his reign. All right, so that middle clause that he went to the doctors rather than going to God appears superficially to be condemning him for going to a doctor rather than going to God. That if he had wanted to cure his ailment, well, Adonai is your healer. God is your healer. You go to God. And he did not, and thus it didn't get better. And he is implicitly condemned in this passage for failing to go to God and choosing instead to go to a doctor. Now, whether you have ascribed to this view or not, there are many in our modern world who do believe that healing should be left to God, that the only form of cure that is worthwhile is to pray and seek forgiveness, to repent, and to otherwise engage in acts of faith and contrition that will restore the relationship between person and God in order that the person will be healed. And to go to a doctor is not merely ineffective, but is in fact counterproductive, because by going to a doctor like Asa in this reading, you would be showing a lack of faith in God. And well, that's not going to make God happy. And that means your healing is doomed to fail when it comes at the hands of the doctors. Now, these three verses present a conundrum when we read them superficially. However, as you hopefully are aware, our sages and scholars of old did not read things superficially. And for that, we are eternally grateful. While Judaism certainly encourages each of us to read Torah and the rest of Tanakh individually and to be inspired and enlightened by its words, we also caution constantly against thinking that your read, especially of a translation, is going to be the slam dunk, perfect, comprehensive, leaving nothing out and not having any problems with it interpretation. We do not have an opinion, like some faith groups do, that the individual will constantly be guided by God to come to the right conclusion all on their own. In fact, we are constantly warning people that your own conclusion is often guided by your own intuitions, which are often flawed, your own assumptions, which are often biased, and your own fears and hopes, which again are often unexamined. So this is why we encourage discussion, debate, and scholarship that is deeper than anything superficial. So in that vein, let us begin just a tiny bit, because after all, there's no way to sum up 3,000 years of discussion in any amount of class, but we will begin to at least scratch the surface of how Judaism answers the questions of what these different verses mean with regards to what we should do when we are ill and how we should experience or interpret our illness. So Rashi, going back to Exodus 15, where it talks about God being the healer. So taking an excerpt, I will not place on you. So this is the standard way that Rashi will talk. You will see what's called a dibur hamatil, an opening sentence, and he is going back to this idea, which I have imposed, right? And I will not place them on you. I will not impose them. Obviously, different translations will be slightly different. So Rashi is talking about that phrase, and he says, and if I do place them on you because you refuse to hearken to my voice, it will be as though they had not been placed on you. For if you repent of your disobedience, sorry for the typos, I will remove them immediately. All right, so first half here is to say that God is not going to cause us to have these illnesses unless we are refusing to do the mitzvot, in which case they would happen. However, should they happen under those circumstances and you repent from your disobedience, then they will be removed. And we know that because of the end of this verse, because I, God, am the Lord that heals you. All right. Rashi then explains, this is its midrashic explanation. Now, midrashic explanations are different than what he's going to give in the next half, what's called the literal sense, or pshat, the straightforward interpretation. So midrashic explanation means that our sages were looking into the different verses to find insight that were not the the obvious import of those phrases. They were not the necessarily most straightforward understanding within that context, but nonetheless contain either an important insight or an important teaching that is more deeply buried within that text. And that is that first half. Now, the alternative reading, but according to its literal senses, Peshat, instead we should read, "For I am the Lord who heals you and teaches you the law and commandment in order that you may be saved from them." That is to say, these diseases. Like a physician who says to man, "Do not eat this thing lest it bring you into danger from this disease." Common advice from most doctors at different times. So too it states in Proverbs 3, "It," meaning obedience to God, "will be wholesome to your body," implying that disease will not fall upon you. So what Rashi is saying is the pshat meaning is that God is using the phrase, "I am your healer," almost metaphorically, to say, look, I am like a doctor, and I am trying to tell you how to have a happy and healthy life. And the remedy that I'm giving you, or the preventative care that I'm giving you, is Torah. That's your prescription. Follow the instructions in that prescription, and you will be fine. Same way that a doctor would tell a patient, follow this prescription and you will stay healthy, eat vitamins, plenty of exercise, yada, yada. So too, the Torah is acting as a prescription to keep you healthy. So this is more preventative than curative. And that, says Rashi, is the actual pshat meaning. It's straightforward meaning. Yes, this could also be interpreted as a reminder of the power of tshuva, of repentance, but we should read this instead as being primarily a preventative prescription and God acting as a doctor who prevents the illness rather than a doctor who is curing the illness. All right, so that's, I hope you find rather an interesting distinction. However, it still seems to be implying that illness is going to be a reflection of a moral failing, that we will get ill when we didn't follow the prescription. Just like the first half, the Midrashic implies that we might be cured when we have had an affliction by turning back to God, but we only got there in the first place because of our sin. That seems to be implying, again, this notion that it is sin that causes illness. So let's continue and find out whether that is indeed the true meaning that this is trying to bring to us. So we're going to turn to the Talmud here, Masechet Sanhedrin. Rabbi Abba said to Rabba Bar Mari that there is an apparent contradiction in the verse. This is the verse in Exodus 15. "All the disease that I placed in Egypt, I shall not place upon you, for I am the Lord your healer." And since God does not place the disease upon the Jewish people, why is healing necessary? All right, so Rabbi Abba is asking a very logical question. Why say you're the healer if you have just promised not to cause the illness? What healing is necessary? Well, Rabbi Bar Mari said to him that this is what Rabbi Yochanan says, meaning here's what Rabbi Yochanan's explanation was. This verse can be interpreted and the contradiction resolved from the content of the verse itself, meaning if you look closely at the verse, you'll see that it is internally explanatory. As it is stated, and he said, "If you will diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord your God." That is to say, if you hearken to God's voice, I will not place the disease upon you. And if you do not hearken to God's voice, I will place the disease upon you. Nevertheless, even if you do not hearken to the voice of God, and I place disease upon you, know that I will heal you, for I am the Lord your healer. So this is the Midrashic interpretation that Rashi first was mentioning, but as is usual, spelled out in much more detail. Rashi often condenses the text that he is relying on for his own reasons, and here we get a fuller understanding. And indeed, it seems to be matching that idea that in general, if we're doing the right thing, we would not expect to get sick. If we do the wrong thing, we will get sick. And if we are sick, we can repent, and that will become a source of healing. All right. So far, it seems like the superficial reading is holding up. But as always, it is never down to just one statement. We must understand everything as interconnected. Well, let's take a look at Or HaChaim, one of the great summary commentaries of the Middle Ages. For I, the Lord, am your healer. The Torah here refers to diseases which are not due to divine intervention, such as the common cold contracted due to one's carelessness. God undertakes to protect us even against such diseases, which are not normally controlled by him if we live according to his precepts. Okay, so very important gradation that Or HaChaim is proposing. As always, no commentary is universal, but this, I think, provides a very interesting distinction. He is saying, how do we understand the contradiction of I am your healer when you just told us I won't cause you to get sick? Well, it's because there are two different types of illnesses. There are diseases which are due to divine intervention, such as the plagues of Egypt, and there are diseases that just happen due to one's carelessness or other situation, as he points out. So things like the common cold, we should not assume these are divine intervention. These are just normal physical problems. The same way that you can get cold by standing outside without a jacket. That's not God making you cold. That's just what happens when you stand outside without a jacket. And likewise, if you are in an area that is bedeviled by an illness, such as during the COVID period, well, if you do not take necessary precautions, you will get sick. That doesn't mean God picked you to get sick. It just means you were in a situation that created more probability of that illness. Now, what do we mean by saying that then God is our healer? It means that in addition to trying to protect us from those things which would come about due to our disobedience, by which God gave us Torah to know how to live, even those things which come about from other purposes, God undertakes to protect us, even against such diseases which are not normally controlled by him. That if we live according to his precepts, God will even provide us healing from those more mundane types of ailments that are not part of divine intervention, but are instead just a common part of the world. Now, this seems to be implying that there is much in the world that is not meant to be interpreted as divine intervention, as a divinely ordained illness that the person is suffering from. Sometimes a cold is just a cold rather than a lesson or a punishment. However, it is still also including the idea that should we be suffering from one of those more common ailments, we can still turn to God for help because, well, God will also help against that type of problem. God is not only involved in the plagues of Egypt level of illness or the particularly targeting of a extremely wicked king in Tanakh, for example, but God is also there to help even for things that were not sent by God, even for things that were not designated as godly punishment. Okay, hopefully that distinction is sticking because it's important to understand. Very often, many people will interpret everything as being a deliberate punishment or causation as being God, and Or HaChaim, who's talking about many others, talking on behalf of many others as well, is saying that is not always the case. Yes, God can help us with any situation, but that does not mean God causes every situation. Okay. And when we turn to Brachot 60, we're going to see a little bit of a story of some disaster of problems and how the rabbis reflect on that situation. When he emerges from the bathhouse, what does he say? All right, so this section of Brachot is talking about different blessings that a person can say at different moments as a way of praising or showing gratitude to God. And in this case, they are asking if there is a special blessing to say when one leaves the bathhouse. Rav Acha said, I give thanks to you, Lord, that saved me from the fire. All right, now that seems a little strange because you were in the bathhouse, you weren't in a furnace. Why are you saying thank me for the fire? Well, as we see a story, I'll explain a little bit about the architecture of why that is a very apt blessing to say. The Gemara relates, Rabbi Abahu entered a bathhouse when the bathhouse floor collapsed beneath him, and a miracle transpired on his behalf. He stood on a pillar and saved 101 men with one arm. That is to say, he held one or two people in his arm, with others holding on them, and so on, so that all were saved. Okay, so if you ever have a chance to travel to the Mediterranean or Israel itself, you will see examples of the ancient world bathhouses. And they were a multi-story construct. There was a layer at the top, which was tiled and where the baths might be, and you'd be walking across it. But underneath it, there were hollow areas that were filled with fire, because it was a heated from below kind of system. Remember, they didn't have water heaters, no easy way to pipe water into a bath. So instead, they simply heated everything from below with fire. They had all their coal and wood and charcoal down there, and it was a furnace literally beneath the ground you were walking on. And that ground was supported by pillars that were regularly spaced around the floor to hold it up. Well, it doesn't take a genius to realize that that's incredibly dangerous. Yes, if they had modern engineering, it would have been probably a lot safer, but we've got better ways to heat our floor and water. But back then, it was mostly safe, but you also were kind of sort of rolling the dice every time you went to the bathhouse. Because if the floor collapses, you are literally being dropped into a furnace, a burning inferno that is mere feet beneath your feet. And the story of Rabbi Abahu here is that he happened to be standing on one of those floor support pillars. So when the floor collapsed, he was still on top of that pillar, and thus he didn't fall into the fire around him. And as he was there, he was able to hold on to two other people who held on to others and others, so that everybody was able to be distributed by these different pillars and balancing by holding each other, so that 101 people were not dropped into the fire, who otherwise would have died if no one, like Rabbi Abahu, had been standing on that lucky pillar and who had been able to reach out and help others. Okay, so now we can see why someone might say, when you leave the bath and nothing bad happened, that you thank God for saving you from the fire. Continuing, he said, this is confirmation of the statement of Rav Acha, who said that one should offer thanks upon leaving the bathhouse safely. As Rav Acha said, one who enters to let blood, may it be your will, O Lord my God, that this enterprise be for healing, and that you should heal me, as you are a faithful God of healing, and your healing is truth. Okay, because it is not the way of people to heal, but they have become accustomed. So first of all, bloodletting. Unfortunately, this was a very, very common form of healing, and I use that term with reservation, for many parts of the world and for much of our history. The idea was that certain illnesses might be caused by too much blood. And yes, they believed there was such a thing as an excess of blood, and that could have all sorts of negative health problems. And so people would, when they were ill, or sometimes just as maintenance, go to a bloodletter. And this was somebody who would literally cut them and allow some of their blood to drain out. And that would be considered a either preventative or curative treatment. So if you are going to the bloodletter, which was sort of their idea of a doctor, then what would you say? Well, obviously, you're going to start off by thanking God and recognizing that what you're doing is, this is for healing, and that you want God to heal you, and that you know God is a healer, and that God's healing is true. However, there is also this little caveat tucked at the end, which is trying to answer the question, well, if you believe in God and you believe God's healing is real and God's healing is truth, why are you going to the bloodletter? Why not just stay home and, not go to the bloodletter and let God take care of it? Well, as he adds at the end of this blessing, because it is not the way of people to heal, but they have become accustomed. Basically trying to say that in the ancient world, there was this discomfort of people feeling that they needed to trust in God, but that they also wanted to do something within their own hands to try and affect healing. And that he is essentially almost embarrassingly or embarrassedly admitting that, well, we've kind of gotten used to this idea that we should do healing in medicine, even though I know we probably should leave it to you, we're still doing it. As the commentary here points out, Rav Acha is saying that people should not practice medicine as they lack the ability to heal. Rather, healing should be left to God, even though they're going to do it. Okay. Now, as an aside, bloodletting has a terrible track record. Obviously, it's not really curative or preventative in all but very few handful of cases. But most famously, George Washington himself was probably killed by bloodletting. He was ill, and the doctors drained so much blood from his body trying to cure him that it is almost certain that the bloodletting is what finally killed him rather than his actual illness. So please do not think bloodletting is a good idea. The rabbis are experts in Torah, but they are not experts in every form of medicine. And in fact, their lack of their inexpertise in medicine also gives rise to their attitudes towards different forms of healing. Although here we can see them saying, we're going to let people do bloodletting because it might be useful, maybe. We can understand that later when medical science advanced and we actually found things that were truly curative, that is to say, actual treatments that actually cured people of illnesses, the rabbis became much more supportive of that form of healing. That much of their skepticism at this generation, in the time of the Talmud, was because there was no true medical science as far as curatives went. Very, very few things actually had a decent track record of really bringing about healing. Even if it was common, like here, they were accustomed to doing it, that didn't mean they believed it necessarily worked. But even with that statement from Rav Acha, we're going to see a contradictory approach by Abaye here, which has in fact become the more dominant voice throughout our tradition. Abaye responded and said, one should not say this, right? Your statement is wrong. This whole, God, you're the real healer, we really shouldn't be doing it. No, stop saying that, says Abaye. As it was taught in the school of Rabbi Yishmael, that from the verse, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed, our second text before from the book of Exodus, from here, we derive that permission is granted to a doctor to heal. The practice of medicine is in accordance with the will of God. As for bloodletting, the Gemara asks, when one stands after having let blood, what does he say? Rav Acha says he recites in gratitude, blessed are you, God, who heals without payment, which is, I think, a wonderful statement to make in our modern expensive healthcare system, where essentially we have paid somebody to let our blood, but we are reminding ourselves that when we get cured by God, it doesn't come with a price tag. And they felt a little uneasy about paying for the medicine as much as it required back then, and I think many people still do, where it often feels like the price tag is somehow continuing to go up, even if the level of care is not. But I digress. Most importantly here, what we're seeing is that this idea that from the obligation of taking care of somebody that has been injured, we in fact realize that God is saying we must heal, that the doctor is not subverting God's will. The doctor is not preventing God's punishment from taking its effect the way God wished, but that in fact, healing is a permitted activity. And as I said, this indeed is and has been for 2,000 years that we have records, the clearly dominant opinion within the Jewish people. We believe that healing is part and parcel of what God wants to happen in the world. And as such, we seek out new medicines and better treatments and continue to improve it. And we do not feel that we are subverting God's will when we are healing someone, any more than we feel we're subverting God's will when we help the poor. Okay, continuing on, Rashi's commentary on this section of the Talmud, because Rashi did not only comment on the Torah, he also commented on the Talmud. And we don't say the Almighty smote him and he's going to treat himself, right? So Rashi is even more blunt and makes it crystal clear for anybody that might have been confused that when somebody is sick, we do not say, God is punishing him and God is going to treat him, meaning let God cure him. Instead, when somebody is suffering from an illness, whether or not we think God is somehow smiting them, we believe that we have an obligation and the opportunity to try and heal them to the best of our ability. And the Tosafot, which is another collection of commentary found in the about the Talmud, continues on this topic by saying, if one should ask, meaning how do we know this? It can be derived from rapo alone. Now, rapo is the word, he's the healer. And why does the Torah state, "B'rapo yirape," he will surely be healed, right? Why say that in that argument over Exodus 20, when we're talking about the injury, why say that you will surely cause them to be healed? Why have both verbal forms there? One can answer that from rapo, the first infinitive form, alone, we would have only derived the permissibility of the physician to heal man-inflicted wounds. But we would have thought that God-inflicted illnesses would appear as if contradicting the decree of the king. The additional yirape, he will heal, teaches that this too is permitted. All right, now this may be a little twisty rabbinic teaching if you're not used to the way that the Tosafot are presenting the commentary. But the essential element here is that one word would have sufficed, right? You will heal. That should have been enough. But in translation, we often will render this, you will surely heal or surely cause to be healed. And the question is, what is that second surely doing? Now, in the actual Hebrew, they are both verbs based off that same rofeh, the same healing root. So it doesn't quite, it's like you will curatively cure, you will healily heal. It doesn't really work in English, but that's how the Hebrew would sound more directly. And the question is, why is there doubling up of this word for healing? And the answer that the Tosafot are giving is that it is to avoid a misunderstanding. This is a common rabbinic technique of saying that if something were missing or different, you would have come to the wrong conclusion. And what is the wrong conclusion you might have had? The wrong conclusion you might have had is that this verse from Exodus only applied to man-made injuries. After all, it's in a passage that is talking about somebody attacking another person. So you might have thought this only applies when someone hit someone else. But because it's been doubled, well, that second mentioning of healing is there to also give us permission, if not order, that we have to heal somebody that has also been injured by what might appear to us as a God-inflicted illness. And therefore, we have the same level of permission and obligation with regards to somebody who is injured by another person and by somebody who is injured by God. In both cases, we must render aid and healing. Then, the rabbinic word analysis can sometimes feel unusual. Trust me, the more you do it, the more you understand, the more you see the tightness of the argument. But I absolutely understand it doesn't always feel that way from the outside. Okay. Let's go ahead then into Bava Kama. I think we're making some pretty good time. We might even be able to finish this packet today. Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of the later rabbis in the Breita, or latter rabbis in the Breita, excuse me, this is from an earlier text that they are analyzing, who say anyone is liable to pay compensation for loss of livelihood, is liable to pay compensation for medical costs, and anyone who is not liable to pay compensation for loss of livelihood is not liable to pay compensation for medical costs. Why do I need, that is, how do I account for the fact that the verse repeated the obligation for that to pay for medical costs? Remember, it has that doubling verb. Okay, so again, this is rabbinic analysis of the text, which may not seem 100% self-evident. Let me walk you through the question. So back in, actually, it's probably easier to point for this one. Back in our text in Exodus 21, it says that you will pay for his loss of time and you shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. And again, in this translation, that thoroughly healed is the doubling up of the heal verb that happens here in that verse. So if we are seeing that these two are connected, that if you have to pay for loss of time, you have to pay for healing. If you don't have to pay for loss of time, then you don't have to pay for healing. We are still left with the question, though, why do we double up that healing phrase? And the answer that comes back here in Bava Kama is that it is necessary for that which the school of Rabbi Ishmael taught, which is what we had just hinted at before. As it is taught in a Braita that the school of Rabbi Ishmael says, when the verse states, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed, Yerapo Yerapeh, it is derived from here that permission is granted to a doctor to heal, and it is not considered to be an intervention, counter to the will of God. So we absolutely have the opportunity and the permission to provide healing. All right. Now, before we get into the final few passages that I wanted to look at for today, I just want to make sure that we are getting the proper summary. We began with some superficial readings of text, which seem to indicate a little bit of an internal contradiction. On the one hand, it seemed to indicate that healing was left to God, except for injury, and that we had the story of a king that was kind of criticized for not turning to God, but going to doctors instead. We have seen through our text that indeed we can understand that some illness might be from a divine causation. However, we also have seen that some is not. But most importantly, we do not even inquire as those that are in a position to heal of where the illness came from. We instead focus on the act of healing, that we have permission and obligation, just like if we had attacked them ourselves, to provide somebody with healing. And therefore, while we can still debate the theological origin of different types of illnesses and problems that are being dealt with through medicine, we are fully embracing medicine as a means to provide healing. In fact, even in the day when medicine was no more sophisticated than bloodletting, and the rabbis knew that the medicine was not very well established and that it didn't have a great track record, nonetheless, we were still willing to avail ourselves of that type of treatment, no matter its probable failure. We were permitted to save a life using that type of medicine on Shabbat, and we are permitted to do this even in a place where we think it might be a divinely ordained punishment. Healing comes first. Healing overrides all. The rest of those verses implies that we should be turning to God alongside of our turning towards medicine, that we should not forget God as the healer that doesn't charge, that we should be grateful for any healing that we do receive, as after all, it is a reflection that God has created a world in which our physical problems can be solved by physical skill, if we are willing to apply ourselves to that investigation. So that is where we are so far, and we will continue here with a passage from the Jerusalem Talmud called the Yerushalmi. So the Mishnah section here that then gets analyzed says, all of Israel have a part in the world to come. Very famous statement about us that if you are Jewish, you do have a place in Olam Haba. But the following have no part in the world to come. A classic walking back of that statement as a form of hyperbole, as a way to try and level severe criticisms against certain special categories. One who says that the resurrection of the dead is not biblical, major theological argument at the time of the Talmud, or that the Torah is not from heaven, also a problem, or an Epicurean. In their minds, an Epicurean is being used as a strict philosophical hedonist. Rabbi Akiva says, also, one who reads outside books or who whispers over a wound and says, any sickness that I put on Egypt, I shall not put on you, for I am the eternal your healer. Abba Shaul said, also the one who pronounces the name by its letters. That is to say, somebody who tries to pronounce the name of Adonai, the actual Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, as though it were the proper name with vowels. Right? That is Abba Shaul's. You are beyond the pale, but obviously we're here to focus on Rabbi Akiva's beyond the pale, which is for somebody to be using the verses from the Torah as though they were a healing incantation. He is very concerned that people will read the passage from the Torah, which superficially implies that it is only God that heals, and then say, oh, well, I guess I just need to pray. And by pray, I mean chant the verse over and over again that says, God is my healer, God is my healer, God is my healer, and that will heal me from any illness. But Rabbi Akiva is saying, not only is that wrong, but it is on the same level of wrong as denying the entire Torah. That is a huge statement. Obviously, this is meant as hyperbole. This is not trying to say truly it is at the same level, but you need a way to help drive home to people just how seriously wrong that type of thinking is. And to tell people that their whispered incantations is the equivalent of denying Torah is about as strong of a condemnation as you can get. So even for those that believe strongly that God is a partner in healing, we can see that trying to force God as a healer through the muttering of some kind of incantation is impermissible, that the element that is connected is in self-reflection, self-examination, and self-improvement, and that goes hand in hand with the application of proper medicine, of going to an actual legitimate doctor and using actual legitimate techniques that are part of God's actual legitimate creation. We and the medicine are all part of the same physical system, so it is no wonder that they can work. It is up to us, however, to find out how they work, to then use them, and to make sure that everybody has access to it. Okay, now I just wanted to finish off with something a little bit different. This is actually an excerpt from a book called Escape from Freedom, which I highly recommend. It was written in the early 20th century by Erich Fromm, who was trying to understand the changing nature of our society in the modern world, and some of the origins of our foibles, of some of our problems. And unfortunately, some of the mindset that even Jews have over issues of suffering, of illness, of poverty, and other types of difficulties is heavily shaded by a conventional wisdom that is in much part created not just out of the economic systems of the early modern period, but also out of the mindset of the Christian teachings, especially in certain parts of Protestantism from that time period. Even if it's not explicitly stated, many people are still allow that to inhabit their thinking. And this is still common even among many Jewish people without their knowing it. So let's try and understand from his point of view why we are bedeviled by these problems of thinking. So rising capitalism, although it made also for their increased independence and initiative, was greatly a threat. In the beginning of the 16th century, the individual of the middle class could not yet gain much power and security from the new freedom. So we had been locked into castes during the Middle Ages that were very hard to escape from. If you were born to a certain strata of society, chances are you were going to stay there. With the beginning of capitalism, we had more independence and opportunity, and that was good, but there was also some problems. And in particular for this new middle class that was creating not enough power and security in the midst of this new freedom. And freedom brought isolation and personal insignificance more than strength and confidence. After all, who you are, what your identity is, had been defined by your church, or had been defined by your king, or had been defined by your livelihood, your guild, your role as a farmer or as a soldier, and that was now breaking down. We were given more and more freedom, but we weren't being given enough guidance during this time period to know who we were as those chains were being struck off of us. And we weren't being given enough power and security in the midst of that new freedom to actually feel comfortable. Besides that, he, meaning this middle class person, was filled with burning resentment against the luxury and power of the wealthy class, including the hierarchy of the Roman Church. It was becoming more and more obvious that this was corrupt. Protestantism gave expression to the feelings of insignificance and resentment. It destroyed the confidence of man in God's unconditional love. It taught man to despise and distrust himself and others. It made him a tool instead of an end. It capitulated before secular power and relinquished the principle that secular power is not justified because of its mere existence if it contradicts moral principles. And in doing all this, it relinquished elements that had been the foundation of Judeo-Christian tradition. All right, so people are becoming more aware of the inequalities within life. They are also losing their sense of status and of belonging within this hierarchy of life. And in the process of doing so, they are actually losing a sense of God's love, of God's constant presence, and a sense of their own worth and their own importance. It sounds counterintuitive, but I believe Fromm is very much onto this issue that happened in this early modern period, that even as we got more freedom, we were given less to believe good about ourselves. Someone who believed that they were a meaningful part of their community because they were the guy who drove the plow had a place. He had a belonging. He believed that he was needed by his community. But now that he has been turned into a tool, now that he is merely part of a transactional, interconnected economy, well, he himself is no longer important. He himself no longer has meaning or worth. It is just his labor that has meaning. It is just what he is providing for others. And minus that, he is thrown aside. He is not needed. And in the same process of feeling his own worthlessness, he comes to view others as equally worthless. And indeed, both the Roman Church and then especially early Protestantism heavily emphasized the absolute worthlessness of humanity, that God was giving us grace entirely by God's will, and it could not be earned by our good deeds, by our actions, by anything that was meaningful of our contribution. So even God's salvation, which should represent unconditional love, was premised on the idea that we were unconditionally unlovable, and that it would only be God who would do this for us. But in the same process of doing it for us, made us feel, well, like dirt, like trash, like we were absolutely terrible, and thus we viewed each other in the same way. Its doctrines, this is that early form of Protestantism that he is talking about, presented a picture of the individual, God, and the world, in which these feelings were justified by the belief that the insignificance and powerlessness which an individual felt came from the qualities of man as such, and that he ought to feel as he felt. That this was right. You should feel worthless and like a worm. That's what you are. Thereby, the new religious doctrines not only gave expression to what the average member of the middle class felt, but by rationalizing and systematizing this attitude, they also increased and strengthened it, made it worse. However, they did more than that. They also showed the individual a way to cope with his anxiety. They taught him that by fully accepting his powerlessness and the evilness of his nature, by considering his whole life an atonement for his sins, by the utmost self-humiliation, and also by unceasing effort, he could overcome his doubt and anxiety, that by complete submission, he could be loved by God and could at least hope to belong to those whom God had decided to save. This final sentence here is trying to say that for many people, They felt that what they could do and what they were worth doing was so nothing that the only thing left was to just give up, to just believe in God, and God would take care of it all. Because after all, this entire world was horrible. Everybody in it was only sinful, and the best we could hope for was that we would be saved. And of course, in many forms of Calvinism, that was already preordained, and you didn't even get to change that decision regarding you. God had decided whether you'd be ordained, whether you'd be saved before you were born. That form of helplessness feeds into an idea that we have no obligation to help each other. I mean, after all, if the world is sinful, and if the world is pain, if the world is suffering, if that's just what things are, and the best we can do is just submit to it, then why fight it? Why struggle against it? Why heal? Why take care of the poor? Why try to remedy any of the problems that we see in the world around us? Just accept that that's what the world is and hope for better when we leave this world. And in the meantime, just give up, submit. This is absolutely antithetical to Judaism. As we've seen, yes, Judaism absolutely recognizes God's involvement in the world, and that there is the occasional intervention by God to help correct somebody's moral failings through various forms of interaction. However, we are called upon constantly to act in ways to champion those that are downtrodden, that are powerless, that are unable to defend themselves, to heal those that are sick, to clothe those that are naked, to feed those that are hungry, to protect those that are homeless. Judaism has set us up by saying, you are the means by which God will remedy these problems in the world. You are not the problem. The problem is that these things occur. And you can solve those problems through your effort by making better choices and by also directly addressing the needs of those who are suffering. That is ultimately the Jewish response to suffering as a whole, which is to say, we can learn from it, we can reflect on it, we can bear up under it as much as we must, but ultimately our job is to fix it. Ultimately, our job is to alleviate it. And no, we will never fully understand it. The book of Job taught us that very clearly, but we are not free to desist from battling against it. And that battle, that place that we stand in the phalanx of those who want to do what is right and good, that is what puts us on God's side. That is what is our purpose in this world, that we are here to make the world to be precisely what God wishes it to be. And that is not a place of suffering and pain and submission to the problems of this life, but it is a world that has overcome them by choosing better for ourselves, choosing better for each other. And with that, we'll finish for today, and I will see you as we continue in our discussion next week. Take care, everyone, and be well.